A young woman with a disability was pushed to the ground in a crowded subway, as the crowd passed by without offering help or a word. But then, in a quiet moment, Keanu Reeves, wearing a gray hoodie, stepped forward and changed everything. But before we dive into this unbelievable story, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you never miss a twist. The city of New York was half awake, shrouded in a brittle winter morning that pierced through coats and numbed fingertips. Snow dusted the sidewalks like powdered sugar, doing little to mask the cracks beneath. At the Bedford Avenue subway station, the crowd swelled as another train approached, faces buried in scarves, headphones pressed tight, eyes fixed on nothing at all. Among the blur of coats and boots, a young woman named Zariah stood alone near the yellow safety line. She was 27, thin, carrying more stress than her diet could account for. Her coat was worn but clean, her gloves mismatched, and her breath curled into the air like silent prayers. One hand clutched a plastic folder, the kind bought at the dollar store, protecting the only copies of her resume. The other gripped a steel crutch, steadying a leg that hadn't worked properly since an accident 2 winters ago. Today wasn't just another commute, it was a shot, a chance at something better. She'd landed a job interview, her first in 8 months, and had rehearsed every possible answer on the train ride over. But now, standing there, heart pounding beneath 3 layers of cotton, Zariah was already exhausted, not from walking, but from bracing. Bracing for the crowd, the looks, the silence. As the train screeched into the station, Zariah leaned forward, her body tense, calculating each step like a game of survival. She didn't expect kindness, just space, a moment to breathe. But as the train doors slid open with a mechanical sigh, the crowd surged forward like an unstoppable wave, and Zariah could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. The platform was an ocean of people, all shuffling forward in a mechanical dance, boots and heels clicking like clockwork against the cement. Yet, in this crowded space, no one looked at her, no one paused, and most certainly, no one cared. The rhythm of the crowd didn't break for a second, as if Zariah didn't exist. People moved in unison, a flood of impatience chasing warm seats and standing room. For most, it was just another Tuesday. Routine, familiar, a blur. For Zariah, it was a moment of dread, the edge of everything she had been working for. This wasn't just another commute. This was her chance, and it felt like the weight of her entire future was balanced in the seconds to come. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the steel crutch she clutched in one hand felt heavier than it should. The cold stung her fingertips, but it wasn't the chill of winter that made her shake. It was fear. Fear of being ignored, of failing to make it on the train, of missing the interview that had cost her so much hope. Zariah adjusted her grip on the crutch, her fingers stiff with cold and nerves. One step forward, she found the yellow safety line with the toe of her boot. Another step, but the moment she tried to slip into the flow of bodies, the gap she had hoped for was already closing. People pressed in from both sides, unintentionally but relentlessly, making her feel like she wasn't even there. A man in a tailored coat brushed past her elbow without so much as an apology, barely noticing the woman struggling behind him. His pace didn't falter, his focus on the train ahead. A woman next to her, holding a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, muttered under her breath, "Ugh, come on," as though Zariah were somehow the delay. The words were sharp, and they stung. Zariah kept her head down. It was easier that way. If she didn't see their faces, maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't hear their judgments so loudly in her mind. The feeling of being invisible, of being a part of the background, settled in her chest like a stone. But she could feel the weight of every glance that passed over her. It was a reminder that for most people in this crowded station, she was just another obstacle to overcome. No one slowed down. No one noticed her struggle. "Excuse me," Zariah said softly, the words barely escaping her lips above the din of the crowd. The murmur of voices and the screech of the train's brakes made her feel smaller, more invisible. She tried to push her way forward, but the crowd was relentless. No one moved. Her voice was lost in the chaos, as if it had been swallowed up by the rush of the morning commuters. The space between her and the train doors was shrinking with every passing second. The doors were still open, but the seconds were ticking away, and with every tick, her chances of getting on the train seemed to fade. The cold metal of her crutch slipped a little on the wet platform as she shifted her weight, and she felt a slip, just a moment of imbalance, before she caught herself. Her plastic folder, holding the only copies of her resume, pressed tighter against her chest, as though it might somehow protect her from the judgment she felt in the air. She didn't have a spare copy. She couldn't afford to lose the one she had. Still, she tried again. "Sorry, I just need to," she began, her voice cracking. It was a quiet plea, a desperation hidden in the softness of her words. But the crowd didn't notice. No one moved. Everyone was focused on getting on the train. No one cared about the young woman trying to make her way through. And then, just as she had almost given up hope of making it, a sharp shove from behind startled her. She wasn't expecting it, wasn't ready for it, and it made her stumble, her balance tipping precariously for a moment. She gripped her crutch tighter, trying to steady herself. The motion had been quick and harsh, but it was a small gesture in a crowded space. It wasn't a full shove, not one with intent to hurt, but it was a shove that spoke volumes. "Watch it!" a voice from behind her snapped. Zoraya's heart raced, and she turned slightly, barely able to make out who had spoken. It didn't matter. They didn't matter. It wasn't the person's face she saw, but the weight of their disregard. She wasn't seen. She was just in the way. Another obstacle in the path of those rushing to their destination. Zoraya hesitated for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Her leg was trembling, not from the injury, but from the growing weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest. She was used to obstacles, the kind she could see and prepare for, but this felt different. Her leg felt weaker now, the tremor more noticeable, and every second felt like it dragged her deeper into self-consciousness. She glanced around at the faces near her. Not a single one looked back. All of them were busy with their own thoughts, their own distractions. Some stared at their shoes. Some scrolled through their phones. Nobody wanted to acknowledge the girl who was slowing things down, who was in their way. Zoraya's heart sank. This wasn't just about getting on the train anymore. This was about being seen. And for a moment, she wasn't sure if that would ever happen. And somewhere, half a dozen feet away, tucked into a shadow near a support column, stood a man in a gray hoodie and a faded baseball cap. He didn't carry a briefcase, didn't hold a phone, and his shoes were worn but comfortable. His presence was understated, unnoticed in the sea of busy commuters. Yet, despite his ordinary appearance, his gaze was steady, quietly following the one person no one else seemed to see, Zoraya. He was watching her struggle without any judgment. His eyes not filled with impatience or annoyance, but with a quiet sense of something else. Something almost like understanding. Zoraya didn't notice him. Not yet. She was too focused on the pressing crowd, the way her body was fighting against the throngs of people. Every step she took felt like it came at a price, each move a gamble for a sliver of space. She adjusted her crutch, her fingers stiff with cold, and tried to squeeze into the next small gap that opened. But the train was almost full now. The doors were almost closing, and the silence around her felt colder than the winter air. The faces around her remained indifferent, like strangers passing by on the street, never pausing to see the person they were brushing against. The train was at full capacity, and there was no time left for hesitation. She saw the gap, a sliver, just wide enough for her to slip through, just barely. Zoraya took a breath that didn't quite fill her lungs but still propelled her forward. She stepped carefully, trying not to rush. She had a second, maybe two, to make it. If she moved quickly and with precision, she could do it. But no sooner had she taken that step than the crowd shifted behind her, and someone groaned with impatience. "Oh, for God's sake," a voice muttered, and before she could even turn to see who had spoken, someone's shoulder collided with hers. It wasn't a full shove, but it was enough, a subtle push that made it clear, "You don't belong here." Zoraya's balance tipped, and in a flash, her crutch skittered away from her grip, the cold metal sliding across the slick platform. Her leg buckled beneath her, and she felt herself falling. The sound of the fall wasn't loud, it was a soft, startled gasp, but in the tense, crowded space, it felt like an explosion. She hit the ground hard, landing on her side. Her hand instinctively gripped the plastic folder to her chest, but the impact caused it to bend. Pages scattered across the floor, curling at the edges as they slid toward the train doors. Her crutch clattered loudly, skidding away like it was a forgotten object. No one moved. The silence that followed Zoraya's fall was deafening, but it wasn't the absence of sound that felt crushing, it was the absence of empathy. Someone, a stranger with no sense of care, stepped over her scattered papers without so much as a glance. Another person sighed, sidestepping her as if she were just an inconvenience, like a spill someone else would clean up. No one offered a hand to help her. No one asked if she was okay. There was no pause, no acknowledgement. The world moved on around her, and she was left alone on the cold ground. Zoraya froze, her body tense with a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. Her knees screamed in protest, the pain from the fall not nearly as sharp as the ache in her chest. She blinked quickly, willing herself not to cry, to keep the tears at bay. Her face burned with shame, and her hands trembled as she reached for her crutch, but it was just out of reach, sliding further away with every attempt. The folder she had worked so hard to prepare for the interview lay sprawled beside her, its contents now a mess. The pages were wet from the melting snow, curling at the edges, and some had even slipped into the grime of the platform. "Geez, she just tripped," a man nearby scoffed, his voice dripping with annoyance. "Why is she making a scene?" His words were like a slap in the face, loud enough for Zoraya to hear. The cruel judgment weighed heavily on her, and she could feel the sting of humiliation crawling under her skin. A woman, just a few steps away, whispered in a voice that was too loud to be considered quiet, probably looking for sympathy. "That's how they get money these days." The words pierced Zoraya, and she could almost feel them wrapping around her throat, choking her. The cruelty was casual, as if the woman had convinced herself that Zoraya's pain was a performance. Zoraya's lips parted, but no words came out. Her throat was tight, her voice lost in the crowd. It wasn't that she couldn't speak, it was that she no longer felt like she had a voice here. The worst part wasn't the fall. It wasn't even the physical pain. It was the way people looked at her, judged her, and then chose to ignore her, like she was nothing more than an inconvenience, a problem to avoid. The judgment was instant. Compassion, if it existed at all, was delayed and too weak to make a difference. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and the trembling in her hands made it harder to reach for her crutch. It was just out of her grasp, as out of reach as the help she would never receive. The folder, now damaged, was no longer just a tool, it was a reminder of how little the world cared. Zoraya squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the tears back, but it didn't matter. In this moment, nothing mattered except the distance between her and the world that had left her behind. "I'm just trying to go to work," Zoraya whispered to no one, her voice barely audible, but full of frustration. The words hung in the air, empty and unheeded. The crowd remained indifferent, but then, like a knife slicing through the already heavy silence, came the laughter. It didn't come from the people bustling around her. No, it was worse. It came from the uniformed man at the far end of the platform, the one tasked with overseeing the chaos. His eyes gleamed with a mockery that stung deeper than the cold air around her. The man smirked, arms crossed over his chest, standing tall with a sense of authority that he wore like a badge. His voice was cutting, dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe next time, leave earlier, sweetheart." The words struck her hard, and she felt herself shrink further. His mocking tone was a public reprimand, not just aimed at her but at her very existence in that space. This wasn't just cold. This wasn't just indifference. It was humiliation, deliberate, public, and unchallenged. The sting of it lingered in the air long after the words had been spoken, echoing in her chest. Zoraya closed her eyes, trying to shut out the cruelty. She wasn't sure if she could bear much more of it. The worst part wasn't the insult. It wasn't even the coldness of the crowd or the distance between her and the world. It was that no one stepped in. No one defended her, not even a passing glance of sympathy. Except for one person. The man who had been leaning against the pillar the entire time. He hadn't moved, not until now. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, not with pity, but with something different. Resolve. There was something in the way he stood, the stillness of his posture, that made it clear. He wasn't going to let this slide. He took a step forward, quiet and deliberate, like snowfall settling on the ground, unnoticed by most, but undeniable in its presence. Then he took another. Because someone had to. Someone had to break the silence, challenge the apathy. The quiet after the insult was louder than the subway's screeching brakes, and Zariah, frozen in place, felt the weight of it more than she could stand. The train should have moved by now, the doors should have closed, and the platform should have emptied. But everything hung in the air as if the world itself knew something was wrong. The silence stretched longer, thick and heavy, like a collective breath held by the universe. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, Zariah heard the snap of a camera shutter. Someone was taking a picture, not out of concern, not to help, but to capture the spectacle. The flash of a camera was like a final punctuation on her isolation. She was reduced to a moment, a scene, an event for others to gawk at. The uniformed staff member chuckled again, his voice dripping with condescension. "Come on, miss. If you can fall that fast, you can stand that fast. Let's move it." The words were casual, almost bored, like he was giving a command instead of an insult. Zariah's heart sank deeper, the humiliation squeezing the last bit of strength from her. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground and never come back. But then, cutting through the air like thunder in a snowstorm, came the voice. Low, steady, undeniable. "That's enough." It wasn't loud, but it was firm, and it carried a weight that made even the train staff member pause. Heads turned slowly, uncertainty rippling through the crowd like a wave. Some hesitated, unsure if they had really heard what they thought they had. The staff member blinked, caught off guard by the calm authority of the voice. Zariah looked up, her eyes blurry with the sting of the fall, and saw him. The man who had been quietly watching the scene unfold from the back of the crowd. He wasn't dressed in anything particularly notable. Gray hoodie, faded black jeans, scuffed boots, and a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. He didn't scream power, and yet, there was something about the stillness in his expression that commanded attention. He walked forward with a calm that made the crowd part for him without a word spoken. He didn't push, didn't force his way through. The space opened naturally, as if they all sensed the shift. He reached down, not to grab her or pull her up uninvited, but to retrieve her crutch. He held it out to her with both hands, his gesture careful, respectful, as if he were handing her something precious. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything Zariah needed in that moment. "May I?" he asked softly, his voice a quiet question that carried more weight than anything else. Zariah stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what she expected, but this wasn't it. Her mind scrambled, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. It took a moment for her to nod, a small movement, barely perceptible, but enough for him to understand. With care, he helped her up, his touch steady and gentle, letting her control the pace, never rushing her, always patient. As they stood together, Zariah looked at him more closely. The hoodie, the cap, it all faded into the background. What mattered now was the line of his jaw, the quiet confidence in his posture, the warmth in his gaze. The crowd had been moving, but now there was a ripple of recognition. Someone gasped, and a voice whispered, "Is that Keanu Reeves?" The train worker sneered, his grip on authority unshaken. "Look, I don't care who you are. This doesn't concern you." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his voice now calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "When you laugh at someone on the ground, when you humiliate them in public, it concerns all of us." He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a sleek leather wallet, and flipped it open in one smooth motion. Inside, a badge, Keanu Reeves. Strategic Equity Partner. New York City Accessibility Transit Initiative. The air around them thickened. The shift had come. Silence descended again, but this time, it wasn't the same. It wasn't the kind of silence that ignored the pain, but the kind that felt like a dam had cracked and something powerful was about to happen. The air was thick, and Zariah could feel it, the tension before something had to give. Keanu's voice dropped, low and razor-sharp. "You're done here." His words cut through the silence like a blade. The train worker opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time that morning, Zariah didn't feel small. She didn't shrink beneath the weight of judgment. The silence had shifted. It wasn't the indifferent quiet of the crowd anymore. It was the kind of silence that recognized wrong, too late, and felt guilty for having ignored it. The worker stepped back, his face flushing. The bravado he had once carried was replaced by something closer to shame. His mouth moved, trying to summon that same authority, but the weight of Keanu's presence was too much for him to hold onto. The worker muttered under his breath and turned away, fading into the shadows of the platform, hoping to disappear. But the story had already caught up to him. Someone had started filming. Someone was whispering, "It's him. It's really him." Zariah stood quietly beside Keanu, his hood up against the wind, hands in his jacket pockets, a calm presence in the chaos. They walked in silence. She limped slightly, her crutch clicking against the sidewalk. The folder, though wrinkled, was safely tucked under her arm. Keanu kept a careful distance, but always matched her pace, letting her lead. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm supposed to be at an interview. It's a receptionist job. Small place. Nothing big." Keanu looked at her with a gentle, understanding expression. "It matters to you, so it's big enough." Zariah hesitated, unsure of how to respond. No one had ever made her feel like her goals didn't need to impress anyone. "You don't have to come," she said after a long moment. "I know," Keanu replied simply. "But I want to." And he did. All the way to a narrow, weathered brick building with peeling paint and a hand-lettered sign in the window. Please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. It helps us reach more hearts and bring more untold voices into the light. And remember, kindness doesn't need a stage.